Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the next episode of this series where we're going to be talking about feminism, a very important topic of course, and one that is very crucial to the discourse. So before we begin, inshallah, we're going to start with the poem, the Londoniyyah poem in the Arabic language, or that part of the poem which specifically relates to feminism, and then we're going to come back and do a sharh or an explanation of it.
فصل النسوية والنسوية دعت لما أسى للاستواء بين الرجال والنساء ثم لها مراحل تعد ثلاثة لأجلها تعدوا أولها في الانتخاب طالبت فسمحوا لها وبعد شاركت وبعدها قمن بما تقوم رجالهم ورمن ما تروم حتى رأينا أن من في البيت عاملة في سجنها المقيت وبعدها طالبن باستواء بلا تفاوت ولا انتهاء.
So this part of the poem is discussing the different waves of feminism. As people will be aware, there are different waves. There's the first wave of feminism, the second wave, third wave, and so on. First wave feminism is really a wave of feminism which relates to enfranchisement of women. So this is really a cause-based wave. You know, the main thing here was voting. And before that, actually, you could say you had Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of Women's Rights, and that was in response to Rousseau, actually. And it's really interesting to see the kind of things that Mary Wollstonecraft was asking for in the book. She wasn't asking for the same kind of thing that we find in second wave feminism, and she was not asking for the kinds of things we see obviously in third wave feminism. So the kind of things that we'll talk about, education and these kind of things. But then it was all about the vote. And so in 1918, a group of European countries became allowed the vote for women. Obviously, 1919 and 1920, countries like Canada and Britain and so on, they also joined that group of countries. So you could say in general, from the years 1918 to 1920, enfranchisement or women's suffrage became an issue that was on the table and became solved, and many people had become these countries had actually allowed the women's vote. So actually what we have to be specific here, that it's still in the UK, women over the age of 18 couldn't vote. This happened later on, I think it was 1929. It was actually women that were over the age of 30 that could vote in 1918. So this is very important. It's not just the case though that first wave feminism had an impact, right, on the vote. This is probably a misconception. There were other issues which relate to discourse which are very important that this had an impact on. Of them is the age of consent, actually, which is a huge thing, especially from our perspective because of the discussion of, you know, the Prophet's marriage to Aisha and all these kind of things. In the year 1929, the age of consent changed from 12 years old for women, in the UK we're talking about, to 16. Okay, there was a change in the age of consent. Now the question is, why did that change take place? And you got to look at obviously the historical timeline. This is after World War I. World War I took place between 1914 to 1918, and there's the Liberal government came into power, and they had policies of development. They were trying to develop the country again, infrastructurally and educationally. And if you look at the reasons why, you know, the age of consent moved, a lot of it was actually pegged on education. So education became, and look at this now, I mean, we consider a child until they finish school. So the age of consent, really, the notion of how a child is conceived, it was actually differentiated in this time period. It was absolutely the norm. This is less than 100 years ago, actually. Less than 100 years ago. I just want you to think about that, right? It was absolutely a norm for a 12-year-old to be married. It was actually in the books. It was allowed for a 12-year-old to have intercourse and so on. So the thing that really changed this was the pressure of the feminist movement, and then obviously because England had been what it was, Britain had been what it was in terms of its colonial positioning, countries like India, which if my memory serves me correctly actually implemented this law before England of the age of consent, had already been influenced by that discourse. So first wave feminism, it's not correct to think that the only cause that they kind of had an influence on was enfranchisement or the woman's vote. There was actually other causes. This is one of them. Now, first wave feminism was actually also related to racism, and people don't know this, and it's a very important point to note, yeah, that the main kind of founding mothers of first wave feminism were racists. And they were racist specifically to black people. You got on your PowerPoints here, if you can see in the
First wave feminist.
yeah, first wave feminism, yeah. So as you can see here, it says it's mentioned 3 women here: Elizabeth Stanton, Millicent Fawcett. And by the way, there's something called the Fawcett Society here in the UK named after her, this woman. She was racist. She didn't mention the lynching. The lynching came from a woman called Rebecca Latimer Felton, who was the first senator of the United States. And by the way, senators are more important than women in the House of Representatives. She was talking about black people being lynched. So this person that they celebrate in America, they celebrate, and I put the reference there, they celebrate her as the first woman senator. She was saying black people should be, how could they get the vote, she was saying. These blacks, these fools, how can you let these blacks have the vote and not us? This is the understanding, because don't forget, black people had the vote before who? Before women did. Black people in America had the vote before women did. And so this woman was saying, how could these blacks have the vote? You should lynch them instead of giving them the vote and not us. So when women in this country and in other places, they associate themselves with this, and 100 years of, I remember just some time ago, 100 years of, enfranchisement and voting and the first wave, and you'll be taught this. They don't tell you that these are colonial racial people, that they were talking about lynching blacks. This is in the historical record. It's not something which it's an open secret, if you like, So there's 2 or 3 things we need to understand. Yes, they influenced the discourse, but they did so for privileged purposes. They believed in entitlement. They were entitled women. They weren't talking about women in other countries in the colonies. They weren't talking about in the developing world. They only cared about themselves, to be quite honest with you. And if they didn't care, if it was all a humanitarian and egalitarian ethic, then what about black people that you're talking about lynching? You see, this is a very strong argument if you think about it. And this already, it shows us the colonial nature of feminism, okay? And the racial nature of feminism. It really is a colonial elitist discourse which can be traced back with sources. You'll be surprised that in the 19th century there was something called wife selling. These are some things in the UK that it was difficult for some people to divorce their wives. Very difficult to divorce their wives. What they do, they go and sell them in the market. They used to sell. Now this, by the way, we don't want to be, how people are orientalist towards Muslim narratives, and we don't want to be the same. This was not a law, as far as I know. This is not a law in British statutes, but it was something that was practiced up until the 19th century. So you can see why this would aggravate women. They would actually literally, if you look online and see how wife selling, they would literally be tied up, put this thing on their face and literally like animals, and come and sell my wife and this and that. They had all kinds of practices, by the way. If a woman wanted to get a divorce in 18th century Britain, and she had to prove that her husband was impotent sexually, there was a practice that they used to go to court, and she used to have intercourse with her husband to show that she couldn't finish the job. And the judge was there to see. So they had all these kinds of weird practice. Well, it's not very weird now, actually. This is something that's revived itself in different ways in the current time. But this is weird practices, of course, from a legal perspective is what I mean. And that's really the backdrop of the feminist movement, why it came about contextually. Any questions here?
Sorry, you mentioned Elizabeth Stanton and Millicent
Fawcett, yeah.
Well, these were the 2 who you said.
So they were racists.
They were the founders of First Wave.
So they were key figures in first wave feministic discourse. The other one, Stanton, that I've mentioned, the last one, she's the one who talked about lynching black people. She was the first senator in America. She was the one who said lynch, used the term lynch.
Okay, so who's the founder?
Yeah.
Could they, because you're saying it's linked to racism.
Yes.
Could a feminist say this is a one person, one opinion?
No, this is not one person, one opinion. This was a movement. Yeah, this was. There's actually papers written on this. It's quite easy to find the papers written on this. It was a discourse that was actually cross-national. Like even in the UK, you had the racists. In America, you had different. It was surprisingly popular opinion to be racist as a feminist at that time. It was surprisingly popular opinion. I've given 3 names, but there are others we can give.
You said the first female senator. Is it Latimer Felton or the top one?
Stanton is the first senator. The last time I mentioned the slide. Interestingly, there's something called the Fawcett Society here in the UK. It's one of the major feminist societies named after this racist woman. Anyways, put that to the side. So we talked about suffrage. We talked about the countries. Now, I've put something interesting here, which is some examples of legal analogical reasoning. So this is Roe versus Roe or something. It's called Roe versus Roe, and this is something that I saw that was seemed to be like a judgment, and this is why marriage of someone under 16 is seen as abhorrent at this time. I found it quite interesting. So according to modern thought, already is telling us what's going on, it is considered socially and morally wrong that persons of an age at which we now believe, so he's already telling us, now we believe, when was now? 20 years ago, literally, yeah? Or whatever it may have been. We now believe to be immature and provide for their education. So education's at the center. Remember, so now adulthood is connected to what? Education. If you haven't finished your GCSEs, you're not an adult somehow, right? That's the idea. They didn't have GCSEs then, but the idea is your adulthood and your maturity is connected to your education. And once again, education became a big thing because the Liberal government wanted to develop the country. So we have to understand that that is their standard, okay? And it's very difficult to moralize on this basis because you can see clearly the historical development in this country and other countries where it started to be moralized that actually this was a decent age for marriage or intercourse, and this was not a decent age for marriage and intercourse. It's not really a biological or physiological thing, where they, say it is really pegged strongly on education, or lack thereof.
So you're just saying that these three people, they contributed to the finding of first wave feminism.
Yes.
And they were racist.
Yes.
Is that what we're going on?
That's what we're saying right now. Yeah, that's exactly right. Remember, first wave feminism isn't really the influential one, if you want to call it that, right? And that's why we're going to segue now into second wave feminism, okay? And this is where it really is interesting. It really, really is interesting because second wave feminism it happened in the 60s, okay? America and the UK, the civil rights movement. And this is where women obviously came out and said we want equal pay, talked about abortion, all these things, no problem, okay? But it's also when you had this drudgery, you had this almost disdainful, if you like, tone towards domesticity. And so a woman being in the home, in fact a mother, a mother became the subject of attack. All of the major, three main names that you need to know about second wave feminism in terms of academics. Number one is Simone de Beauvoir. The second one is Betty Friedan. And for the sake of argument, why not put Germaine Greer there as well? Yeah? Germaine Greer, who's still active, by the way. She's still about talking and stuff like that, and talking, being controversial. So these three women have published works. The two probably most notable works that you need to be aware of is Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, 1963, and Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. These are the two. It's like their Quran and Sunnah. Sorry to put it in that. It's like their main. You want to put it, their main academic, works. Sorry. I believe it is, yeah. The names are on the slide, yeah. If not, we'll yeah. Yeah, I think it will be on the second thing. So we wrote Feminine Mystique, and Feminine Mystique is where the famous line, the comfortable concentration. The home is a comfortable concentration camp. What was it, Ar-Rahman in the poem? Amilatun fi sijniha al-maqiti. So it's been translated. It's very, that she is a prisoner in her house. By the way, she actually retracted this. Very interesting. In her book called Second Stage, which she wrote some 10 years after or something like this, she said this was a bit extreme for me to say that. People don't realize she made a hell of a lot of retractions. Why did she make retractions? I'll tell you why she made retractions. She made retractions because in the year 1970, she wrote a book called The Second Stage. You can get this book. And she realized by doing these kind of sociological investigations that women were actually having things worse. That things were getting worse for women. I'm going to read something from her book right now. She said that women are experiencing more signs of psychological stress than women in their 20s and 30s had in the 50s and early 60s, she admits. Listen to what she says. And were more likely to feel on edge of a nervous breakdown than young men, she said. So this is after what? After the Civil Rights Movement, after the implementation of Equal Rights Act, after women are going to work, after all of the discussion about feminism, after women were burning bras, after. So if she goes and checks to see if women are happy now because of what she's done, and she realized that actually women are sadder, they're worse off. Their welfare has been affected in the negative. And she says that, she admits this in her book, The Second Stage, which, by the way, you don't find in curricula. You don't find in syllabi, this book, Second Stage. You find Feminine Mystique. Even in GCSE and A-levels, they don't teach any kids about the second stage. It's a book she wrote. And in fact, it's a book she wrote after the book Feminine Mystique. But because it has all these admissions, these dirty admissions, that she puts and she tells us the truth about, we want to hide this under the carpet, do we? Women 35 to 39, 1 in 3, she says in the same book, in the 1970s experienced a nervous breakdown, which is more than a 10% increase, which is in sociological terms quite heavy. So she realized, based on her own study, this is Betty Friedan we're talking about, that more women were suffering after the implementation of all of these things, and after they go into work, and after they've taken up all these attitudes towards domesticity, and the family and the home and the motherhood and all these things. You see. And she even admits, quite interestingly in the book, she goes, women have a profound human impulse to have children. Well, you weren't saying that before. All the tone has changed now, has it? When you see women are suffering and coming to you and crying in nervous breakdowns, now you're saying, well, actually women have a profound instinct, she says, or impulse, sorry, to have children. Well, you weren't saying that before, Friedan. She realizes what she put women in. But is she the only one? You'll be surprised she's not the only one. In 1981, after realizing the troubling psychological impact of women, Friedan states this. Let me just go with Friedan for a second. She says, we had better find a change. But change is hard, because listen to what she says. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable what she says. Listen to this. She goes, because women have almost a religious feeling about the women's movement. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah. She says, we've got to change this now. This is 20 years after everything. She goes, because women now are becoming, it's like feminism has become religion. Who's saying that? Betty Friedan, one of the founding mothers of feminism. She goes, I realize we have to make a change. She's saying this. I realize we have to make a change, but what? But it's difficult now because women have a what? A religious feeling towards feminism. Can you imagine this? A sacredness, a reverence, an awe. This is what she continues. It keeps us from asking questions about what really matters to women now. So, you see, it's really negatively impacted women. She realizes that. She wants to change that, but she can't because she's already created a monster. She's already created the Frankenstein of feminism. She's already helped contribute to that. And now she's trying to pull women back. Actually, we're going too far. No, it's too far. The Frankenstein has already been created. And do you know who's suffering for it? Women are suffering more because of it. And one of the most powerful things I've ever read from a feminist is from Germaine Greer. In her book 1981, The Whole Woman. Remember, Germaine Greer was one of the founding mothers of feminism. See her online. How she's coming with arrogance and talking and smoking cigarette and this and that. And she's with confidence talking about how important it is and attacking domesticity, attacking this and equality and all that kind of. And then what? She comes in 1981, she goes, I mourn for my unborn babies. I mourn for my unborn babies, she says. This is 2 of your big names. 2 already. We're going to come to the 3rd one, which is the worst one, by the way. Which she said, I mourn for my unborn babies, she said. She goes, I still have pregnancy dreams. She's exposing herself. Waiting with vast joy something that will never happen. Because she's past the age of pregnancy. Never happen. Allahu Akbar. It's a punishment for you. Because you were telling all the women. You're telling all the women that motherhood is X, Y, Z and all that. Now you'll be punished because you realize that actually you suppressed your instinct and you hurt yourself. You only hurt you. You're playing with fire. You played with fire and you got burnt. De Beauvoir, who is if you want to put the main woman of feminism in the second wave is De Beauvoir, the second sex, because it had been probably the most robust and thorough philosophical work that had been done on feminism, and up until the third wave, it was the main way in which scholars of feminism would argue for feminism. Okay, this is what she says. We know her thought, right? She attacks the institution of motherhood. She attacks domesticity. She talks about how it's oppressive to be a man, biologically even, and these things. But she says the following. She was talking about she had a boyfriend. His name was Sartre, John Paul Sartre, a huge philosopher, big name. Imagine now she's telling women not to have what? Husbands or this. She's telling them not to have husbands, yeah? Not to be married, not to have kids. But listen to what she says about her own boyfriend. Listen to what she said. She goes, I felt dominated by someone else intellectually. Sartre lived up to the man I had dreamt up until 15. I was simply not in his class. Wallahi, I have not seen one single Muslim woman to ever say that. With the most complementarian lifestyle. She's an egalitarian. She said, I've never heard anything. I was dominated by my husband. I was not even in his class. The most traditionalist woman, the Amish. I've never said, this is what? So you're telling women not to have kids. You're telling women not to, she's like the devil. Wallahi, she is like shaitan. Sorry, let me just go into religious discourse for that. مثله كمثل الشيطان إذ قال للإنسان اكفر فلما كفر قال أنا بريء منك. It's like this in the Quran. It says it's like him, like the devil. He says, go and do disbelief. And when he does it, he says, I've got nothing to do with you. In her own life, what's she doing? She's saying, you're my superior. I'm not even in your class. But she's writing in her books as well. She's writing, don't get married, don't have children, don't allow this from the man. It's like this nonsense hypocrite. She's a nonsense hypocrite.
That's why there's a statement. You're a feminist until you get married.
Well, she wasn't even married. We'll come on to it. She wishes she was. As she even admits. Well, not this, but she goes, I was simply not in his class. She looked in the mirror. Just like you, Ali Dawa. She said something that you said. She said, I detest my own reflection. She goes, if at least my own thought had given birth to a hill, a rocket, but nothing has taken place. I'm astonished to realize how thoroughly I have been cheated. Cheated by who? Who are you talking about? You cheated by yourself. You cheated yourself. Yeah? She's writing her autobiography. She thought we didn't read. Then she also admits, I don't know, she thinks it's a diary entry. She writes the following. She goes, before her boyfriend, Satra, came from Paris, she goes, she was preparing her new independent home in Paris and waiting for the return of Satra from Paris. New furniture is brought, the walls are papered, and new clothes are purchased. Oh, you're trying to make an effort for him, are you? You're trying to make an effort for him, are you? But you tell the woman to what? Not to get married. But you wish you were married. You wish you had that commitment. He called her, one time he said to her, because she came back home, she wasn't, she said, you're like a mere housewife. And obviously in their understanding, this is a huge embarrassment. She says, I was furious with myself to have disappointed him in this way. And he's the one, by the way, if you look at her autobiography, who persuaded her. He's the one who persuaded her to write The Second Sex. So we have a valid question here. Was second wave feminism created by Sartre, by a man? Was he the one doing all the work? Was he the one pushing her to do these things? Why? Because it's in the benefit, we're going to come to realize, it's in the benefit of the man. This is what women don't understand. Please, some women do, of course, but some women don't. Feminist women. That feminism, second wave, benefits the man. Psychologically, as we'll find, more than it benefits the woman. He doesn't need to commit. He doesn't need to have kids. He doesn't need to do all those things. He can move from one woman to another. Use and abuse. Lash and dash, he can. This is the situation. But let's not mention that. What we should mention is some sociological investigations. And the biggest one that's ever been done, that I know of, is this one that is mentioned. It's mentioned in the poem as well. Do you remember what the lines were? Yeah, this is the دراسة غربية that's been through. في مئة ألف, yeah? This is the مئة ألف. It's Blanche Flower and Oswald. This is the name of the study, 2000, okay? 100,000 participants. It's a longitudinal study from the years 1970 to the years 1990 in the UK and the US. Huge study. Very difficult to replicate. And this is what the researchers said, that men are happier and women are sadder. In the time period after the feminist movement has taken its force, and after all the laws have been placed, and after the attitudes have changed, and after women are going to work, why are they happier and sadder? Well, because let me tell you why. Because they say legislative reform and so on has not been successful in either country, in creating or raising the well-being among women. The quote is messed up a little bit on the slides, but that's, you see, this big thing is saying what? In fact, the same study said, do you know who was getting happier? Men were getting happier. They're getting what they want. The commitment issues have gone down. He doesn't have to extract his resources for her. He's got more money now. He can just use her, move from woman to woman. She's the one, she wants security. She's the one psychologically primed for these things. You want to play this game with a man and you think you're going to be happier. You don't know what you're doing. You've created 20 years longitudinal study. It tells us that in fact the welfare of women has degenerated considerably or exponentially as a result of what? As a result, or after at least these policies had been implemented. Now, why is this the case, or what should we think about? I mean, feminists know, even the second wave feminists, that there are differences, considerable physiological and psychological and even biological, as we know, differences between men and women. But basically their argument is, despite all of these differences, that we should be treated the same. Now, the burden of proof is upon the one who's making the claim. Why do we need to be on the back foot? If someone asks you why is it different for whatever ruling it is in Islam or whatever other system even that differentiates between ruling of men and women, so why is it different? Why should it be the same? In fact, Plato, he made a very interesting quote. Aristotle quotes him. He says, "Treat like cases as like," meaning identical things should be treated identically, and different things by extension should be treated what? Differently. Now, your feminism doesn't accommodate for the differences between men and women. That's a failure. That means it has less explanatory scope. Now, why should we cover for their failure or even accept it as a presupposition for answering their questions? They're asking, why is it that, we'll come to it, but why is the inheritance difference? Why is polygamy? Why is man can marry this and that? Why should it be the same, in fact? Why is there an assumption of equality, of absolute equality? This assumption itself is unsubstantiated. And in fact, they need to argue it from first principles. They need to argue why it should be different things should be treated the same. They need to argue that, not us. And in fact, this is one of the key reasons, and very important here, why ridda happens, why apostasy happens, or why shak happens, or why raib happens in the deen, or doubt. And we, because we've been in the back foot for too long, have not been able to answer this properly. The way we answer it is, is the assumption that different things should be treated the same. We believe that identicality in value does not mean, so equality in value does not mean identicality in roles. One more time. Equality of value. We do believe men and women are equal in value. Yeah, in spiritual value they are equal. Equality of value is not equivalent to identicality in roles. This is an extremely important sentence. Memorize it. If they want to tell us that it should be the case, they have to argue for it. It's not me that has to argue for it. But you know what? Sometimes it's quite easy and it's quite straightforward if we point to them the differences between men and women. Because some of them are actually ignorant of it, even though the feminist founding fathers were not ignorant of it. In the chapter biology, de Beauvoir, she goes, women are weaker than men. She will lose to them in the fight. She has less control of herself. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the idea. She says all this thing, but sometimes you have to show them that is a fact. Let's give some examples of that. So these are 3 studies I'm giving you, right? There's one of sexual differences, hormonal differences, and cognitive differences. Cognitive, the way you think, right? So let's start with the sexual differences. Roy Baumeister and Kathleen Cantonese, yeah? This is a study of 2001, big study, one of the biggest I've seen. I think it's one of, if not the biggest. I'm going to read the abstract, just the abstract of the study. Sex difference, the sex difference, yeah? It says the following, it says, the sex drive refers to the strength of sexual motivation. Across many different studies and measures, men have been shown to have more frequent and more intense sexual desires than women, as reflected in spontaneous thoughts about sex, frequency and variety of sexual fantasies, desired frequency of intercourse, desired number of partners, masturbation. What are you looking at? I'm only kidding.
I was going to say you're on TV, be careful.
No, masturbation. Where were we? Liking for various sexual practices, willingness to forgo sex, or lack thereof, initiating versus refusing sex, making sacrifices for sex, and other such measures. Listen to what he says. And there's a woman in this as well. Kathleen Cantonese. No contrary findings. This is categorical, using a huge quantifier. No! Yeah, negating. No contrary findings indicate stronger sexual motivation among women were found. Hence, we conclude that the male sex drive is stronger than the female sex drive. The gender difference in sex drive should not be generalized to other constructs such as sexual orgasmic capacity, enjoyment of sex, and so on. Of course, they can't check that. But this is what? This is the strongest thing you have. You're going to tell us that there's why should different things be treated the same? You see, already when we start outlining the differences, we start realizing, should there not, the question comes up, doesn't it? Should there not be some kind of catering for this difference? Okay, that's sexual difference. Is there any other difference? Yes, of course. Hormonal difference. A woman has anything between 1/10 to 1/20th the amount of testosterone a man has. 1/10 to 1/20th. Now you're telling me that has no effect? That has a huge effect. And as we're going to find with the second bit, it even has a cognitive impact. Not just a physical one. Physically, yes. It has sexual implications, but it has physical implications on strength, speed, all of these things, all of these implications. Hormones are no joke. You know, when a woman has 1/10 to 1/20th, anything between 1/10 to 1, you can't tell me that we're going to have the same laws on every single thing in the absolute. Why should it? Moreover now, cognitive differences. Diane Halpern herself, she came into, she was starting her, she started her study saying she didn't expect to find much differences. She says she revised her understanding. She has a whole book now. It's called The Sex Differences Between Men and Women. She says there's sizable cognitive differences between men and women. Cognitive means the way you think. I'm not saying it means that women are cleverer than women. I'm not saying that. But there are sizable cognitive differences. And in fact, let me say something interesting. This is, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this person's name. Namrata Apodhaya. Yeah? 2014 is a conclusion of a study, yeah? And this connects hormones to cognitive ability. In conclusion, the study says, male cognitive functions, viz. Attentional, perceptual, executive and working memory, were comparable to those of female pre-ovulatory phase cognitive functions. Yani menstruation has an impact. Listen to what he says. This might be due to the analogous action of testosterone and estrogen on the brain. Thus, our study supported the fact that testosterone and estrogen accentuated cognitive functions in a similar fashion. Both men and women, or both males and females, pre-ovulatory phase, so women in the pre-ovulatory phase, right, can compete with each other equally in cognitive tasks. However, listen, males outperform females in attention state, as was assessed by visual reaction time, during the post-ovulatory phase of their menstrual cycles. ناقصات عقل ودين, the hadith says. The women are deficient. Women are deficient in aql, which means, basically, aql is not ilm. Aql is emotional ability. That's what it's talking about. Aql comes from the Arabic word aqal, which is basically when you put like the reins of a horse and you move it left and right. So basically the hadith is saying women are more emotional than men. Now this, if I read this, it's the same thing. Well, it's saying that when the women are ovulating, they have issues with cognition, or their cognition is inhibited. What's the problem? So if the hadith didn't say that, it would be unscientific. So you have an issue with the hadith, let me get you some studies. I can get you 20 studies. Show you, I just gave you one for brevity. But I'll get you 20. But when the white man says it, in this case it was an Indian actually, but when the white man says it with the lab coat, you accept. But when the Muslim says it, or in this case Prophet Muhammad himself, you don't accept. That's because you are indeed a kafir. Not all of them, of course. Some of them have shak, but some of them have kufr. Some of them are kafir, disbelievers. And they pretend to be Muslim. And they actually roll, let's put it in street language, they roll with feminism as their religion. And they pretend to be Muslims. Let's be honest about it. Because this is a religion, even as per what this woman said. Before they used to have religions which was statues and stuff like that, sanam, and the golden calf and all these things. Now they have ideologies, and some people say, you know what, I don't actually believe this Muhammad stuff and this heaven and hell stuff. In their head, you know the thing, they're thinking, I believe in equality. Uqsum billah al-azim is a religion, and Uqsum billah al-azim is one of the major reasons why people have ridda of Islam. Uqsum billah al-azim. And we have these munafiqat, munafiqeen and munafiqun munafiqat. We have these hypocrites in the community, Islamic community, that they pretend to be Muslim, but they believe in this stuff, and they believe it more than Islam, and they will reject Islam because of it. Uqsum billah al-azim, they reject Islam. Deep down in their heart, they don't believe in it. And some of them are not on that level yet. Some of them, these kinds of things, like the hadith that I've just mentioned, it will cause them shak in their heart, but it wouldn't take them out of the religion of Islam. And that I hope to say is probably the majority. It causes them severe doubts, but it doesn't. But there are some, a sizable chunk, who we cannot say they are like that. So we have to be careful, because this stuff inside of it is ridda. This, we're talking about aqidah. You know, this is number one in the aqidah thing. You don't believe what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, you oppose it directly because of some other foreign ideology. That means that you are more inclined to ridda than you are to Islam.
It's like they're taking the aql over the naql.
Yes, they're taking the aql over the naql, but they don't even have the aql, unfortunately.
But the thing is, that's exactly what Iblis done.
Exactly.
That's
Yes.
exactly what he done. He said logically,
Yeah.
better than him.
Mm.
And he rejected the naql which Allah said.
Subhanallah. Wallah, it's true, yeah. It's the same thing. But before, wallahi, you know the Mu'tazila and those guys? They had more right to do that. Because they were taking principles which they thought were logic itself, like maths. They think it was mantiq. These guys, they're taking the opinions of white women. A lot of them are racist. They want to lead to blacks. They're taking these opinions and they're putting it over the opinions of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because they don't believe he was a prophet. But they pretend to believe in it for the social benefits.
It's inferiority complex. And that's,
Yes.
you know when Allah talks about murtads, and he talks about they don't, he talks about Allah will replace them
with a group of people who love Allah and they do not care about the blame of the blamers.
Yes.
Because if you think about it, Allah's talking about the psychology of the murtads.
Mm.
They're very insecure. Somebody will come and say this and that. That's why they go with this rather than the Quran and Sunnah.
It's true, Allah.
That's exactly what
It's true. But so this is the point. We've given 3 examples of sizable difference between men and women in cognitive, biological, and psychological terms. And there are so many examples. It will be unscientific for someone to come and say, no, there's no difference. It will be, and even the feminists don't say that. So that's not even. We're not trying to straw man their argument. But the lay people, they will say that. So there's not much cognitive difference. But then when you show them the studies, and oh, there are cognitive differences. Yeah, well, you just changed your mind, didn't you? All right. So if there are cognitive differences and if there are psychological differences, I'm not saying that there are one is better than the other. We believe at takamul. We believe in when the Prophet Muhammad said, "Innama an-nisa'u shiqa'iqu ar-rijal," which can be translated as musawiyat. Yeah, it can be like we're equal in value. But it also means mutakamilat, which means that they are complementing men. Men and women are like mirror images of one another. They complement one another. So we believe in complementarity over equality. We believe that there are some things that we don't have. وَلَا تَتَمَنَّ, the Quran says, مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضُكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِمَّا اكْتَسَبُوا وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِمَّا اكْتَسَبْنَ وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. That do not wish what the other one has. Men shouldn't wish what women have, and women shouldn't. There are things that women exceed and well, go over and above what men can do, and vice versa. We shouldn't want what the other one has. It's simple as that. There's some things that men have that women don't have, and vice versa. And when we use the breastfeeding example or the giving birth example, they say, well, that's trivial. Why are you using that? It's almost offensive. Why is it offensive? That's huge. Men are more dispensable than women in many ways, because you can freeze sperms, but you can't freeze wombs. You need a womb. If you want the continuation of the human species, you need women. Okay, and you need them to be alive. So, in many ways, men are more dispensable. We're not saying that this is not a polemic against women, but this is a polemic against second wave feminism. Okay, so we talked about the differences. Now, in the backlash literature, you'll find, for example, The Myth of Male Power. It's a very good book. I've recommended it before, and I recommend it. Obviously, he's coming from more like a liberal, maybe egalitarian background, but he still makes very, very good points. And he makes the point, he defines power in a different way, because the question of what's a patriarchy, because that's another big thing with second wave feminism. They say, well, there's an oppressive class and there's the oppressed. The men are the oppressors, and then you have the oppressed. Well, he says, why do you say that? He says, because there's a distribution of power which is uneven. He says, how do you define power? And so Farrell says that he defines power of someone's ability to take control over their own life. He says, when men are being forced to go into war, like in drafting the armies and stuff, he says, is that power? Or is that lack thereof? It is lack of power, because you're being forced to do something you don't want to do. Women have never, almost in all of history, have been forced en masse to go into war and fight and die for the country. But that's happened civilizationally across all history and almost all civilizations since the beginning of time and civilization 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Okay, so that's the difference. Suicide rates are different between men and women. There's a difference there. There's differences in dangerous jobs. How many women apply for dangerous jobs? Like, for example, you see quotas being discussed, especially in second wave discourse. Oh, we should have quotas, we should have equal representation in parliaments. I've never seen quotas being discussed outside of the trash onyx or whatever it's called. We need to have equality here. Well, how come you don't want equality in the army? How come you don't want equality in coal mining? How come I've never seen one single article? Maybe there is, I'm not saying. But these people, like for by and large, they don't ask for that. They don't ask for across the board equality. They ask for equality where it benefits them. Yeah? And it's the same privileged, entitled attitude as we saw with those racists in the first wave. It's not, they don't care about equality and humanity and stuff like that. They don't have that belief. They just want to privilege themselves, and they're using ideological arguments to do so. But you know what? Those particular individuals, they're throwing a boomerang and it's already hitting them in the face. And it will continue hitting them perpetually in the face, because they realize they have gone against the fitrah, the natural predisposition, the psychological, the physiological, the difference between men and women. They don't want to realize their own instincts. They're going to end up just like the founding mothers of feminism, in a regretful state, pitiful, regretful state, where they're making retractions and wish I mourn for this and I wish I could have. And why don't you just realize from the very beginning that actually there are differences and that you should take care of those differences? That's what you should really realize from the beginning. So yeah, these are some things. Now there's some we're going to talk about next week. Third wave feminism, and some new concepts started to become popularized. So Kimberly Crenshaw came and she talked about intersectionality in 1987 in her article. It was a journal article, and she says, and they started to speak about actually it's not like just man and woman. So we talked about patriarchy, but you'll be surprised to find that third wave feminists actually attack second wave feminists a lot on this point. I'll give you an example that I've thought of myself, and I'll read out what Judith Butler said. But before that, for example, imagine a situation in America. Yeah, you had slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and all this kind of thing. Yeah, you have a white man and a white woman. They have slaves, black slaves. Yeah. Now you couldn't argue that, for example, if a white man and a white woman, or even a white woman has a black slave, that black man is taking advantage of what? The white woman, or that he has a power superiority over her. You can't argue that. Why? Because there are different layers of power struggle here. And the same thing can be said of the entire, if you like, Western Hemisphere comparative to the colonized world. How could you compare the colonized tribes in Sub-Saharan Africa or in Middle East or Asia with those who are benefiting from that project, in this case men and women, in the West? So this binary, this dichotomous, this dualistic, this what Edward Said refers to as didactic representation. Yeah, where you have the hero and the anti-hero, the villain. You know, the woman is being oppressed and the man who's oppressing her perpetually all through history. It's actually an untenable thesis, because when you start looking at all of this, to use the feminist understanding, intersectional, different layers of identity. Well, you're not just a woman, are you? You're a disabled woman, you're a black woman, you're a black man, you're a white man, you're Asian, you're whatever, you have this much money. When you start doing a multifactorial analysis, you realize that you can't just say, well, men have been oppressing women all through the countries, the societies and civilization. You can't say that. Depends on what man you're talking about, depends on what woman you're talking about, depends on what power relations you're talking about, and in fact, it depends on how you define power, as we've just seen. There's so many definitions of power. Don't ever just in argument accept their definition of how do you define power. Robert Dahl said that it's the ability for person A to get person B to do something that person B would otherwise not do. Backrats and Barris had some other understanding. Foucault believed power was like a fog, that it was everywhere. There is no consensus on what power is in the first place. And power informs the theories of justice and oppression. So they have a lot to prove, quite frankly. They have to use a very classical definition of power, and then they have to define that power as oppressive. And for them, as we've said, they were starting off by saying that just by a man being in charge of a woman in any capacity, that's oppressive. Warren Farrell makes a very good point. He says a woman in a responsibility in a corporate environment where, for example, she's like a manager, yeah? She mentions this in his book, The Myth of Male Power, and she's like, let's say, for example, a woman that's working in a corporate environment and she's looking after 5 people. The manager comes and says, look, you've got 5 more people that you have to look after now, yeah? So it's 10 people you have to look after. She's going to see that as an expansion of what? Power, because it's responsibility. But when she would never see the same thing about having more children, even though it's also an expansion of responsibility. Why? Because they've denigrated the domestic environment. But it's like for like. In fact, the influence that she's going to have on the kids is going to be more than the influence that she's going to have on the employees. Much more, in fact. But one is regarded as, because it's within a capitalistic framework. And remember, liberal feminists, second wave liberal capitalistic feminists is what the culture is. Although obviously there are Marxist feminists and so on. There's different syntheses, if you like. But the idea here is this. Don't accept their definitions. And you're not on the back foot. In fact, they're on the back foot. And this is a very important point. Judith Butler talks about a patriarchy. And she says something. I'm going to read it out. The political assumption that there must be a universal basis for feminism, one which must be found in an identity assumed to exist cross-culturally, often accompanies the notion that the oppression of women has some singular form discernible in the universal or hegemonic structure of patriarchy or masculine domination. The notion of patriarchy has wickedly been criticized in recent years for its failure to account for the workings of gender oppression in concrete cultural contexts in which it exists. That form of feminist theorizing has come into criticisms for its efforts to colonize and appropriate non-Western cultures to support highly Western notions of oppression. This is who? This is Judith Butler, the third wave feminist. She's attacking the patriarchy. She's saying it's coming to question, or at least she's outlining the problems with it. Yeah? They tend to construct a third world or even an Orient in which gender oppression is subtly explained as symptomatic of an essential non-Western barbarism. Now, I just want to end with bring it back to Islam. We've done 45 minutes, so hopefully this will be the last thing I say, and then we can have a discussion, and then we'll go and pray. Actually, we'll pray and then we'll have a discussion. But some key verses we talked about or that we need to know about is obviously الرجال قوامون على النساء, chapter 4, verse 34. And this is under attack, probably the most under attack verse in the Quran. Because why? Because it does imply that there's some kind of hierarchization between men and women, especially managerially within the domestic environment. It does imply that. It's very difficult to not get that from the verse. If you try and pretend there's equality, you'll lose the argument. 434 does imply domestic hierarchization. Doesn't mean that men are more valuable than women, but doesn't mean that men have a managerial role within the domestic environment in familial settings, which is has more responsibility than women. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِلْرِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً in chapter 2, verse 228, Surah Al-Baqarah, that for men there's a degree of responsibility over them. At-Tabari mentions this is a daraja of mas'uliyah, of responsibility. So men have more responsibility domestically, they have a protective role, and as such, they also have a hierarchy, which means that they, so long as they're not going against the rights of the woman, and this is a big so long as, right? And they're not going against لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق, which is you're not allowed to believe in the creation or obey the creation in the disobedience to the creator. And they're not telling her to do something that will harm her. These are the three conditions. If these three conditions are met, then he is the one who is calling the shots, quite frankly. Let's put it this way, yeah, in the house. So if that's the case, then how can you explain that if you're a feminist Muslim? You'd have to do what Amina Wadud did, which is kufr. She said, I read 434 and I had what she says as a conscientious gap. She even wrote no, N-O. What do you mean no? She said no, yani what? You're saying no to me or Allah? No, khalas, no to Islam. Why are you calling yourself a Muslim? Take your hijab off, leave. Don't pretend to be Muslim. If you say no to a verse of the Quran, no, conscientious gap, leave it, don't pretend to be a Muslim. This is my point. So here the thing is, this is the danger, and this kind of thought is widespread in Western circles. We have to hit it head on. And the way to hit it is not to try apologize and accept their assumptions. We don't accept their assumptions. We don't accept that there should be equality, because they only have a problem with that verse because of the assumption of equality. We say, why do you assume equality? Prove it from first principles. The bayyinah, or the burden of proof, إِنَّمَا الْبَيِّنَةُ عَلَى الْمُدَّعِ. As the hadith says, it's actually a logical principle. The burden of proof is upon the one that makes a claim. وَلَكِنَّ الْبَيِّنَةَ عَلَى الْمُدَّعِ. The burden of proof is upon the one that's making the claim. You're making the claim that despite the physiological differences and the psychological differences and the biological difference between men and women, that despite all of that, there should be equality, that different things should be treated the same. You prove it. I'm going to sit back here in my chair. You prove it. I don't need to prove it. Khalas, then you have lost the argument. I'm not going to be here. Why should I be the one doing all the work for you and trying to prove these things? Why should there be 434? Why shouldn't there be? This because it shows hierarchization. Give them, it does show hierarchization, domestic, familial hierarchization. Yes. What now? Oh, but that's what shows your religion is oppression. Why? You've already assumed that there should be equality between men and women in all cases. Can you prove that? Watch them squirm after that. Watch them. They'll squirm in front of your faces because they have nothing. They have nothing. They have no way of proving it from first principles. So you have to, don't ever sacrifice, we have to never sacrifice our qat'iyat in the religion of Islam for their pleasure. Oh, this doesn't mean this. Oh, but it means this. And that. La, we're not going to do that. Yeah. And there is such a thing as ta'ah, which means obedience to man, to the husband. There is such a thing. وَإِنْ أَطَعْنَكُمْ فَلَا تَبَغُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ سَبِيلًا. It's in the Quran. It's not even a hadith. So, it's in the 434 itself. فَإِنْ أَطَعْنَكُمْ, if they obey you. Try and find me something like for a man, where he has to obey the woman. No, only if she's a political leader, yeah, or his mother. So that's one thing. Another thing, however, having said that, there are some misconceptions. Okay, so we talked about this stuff. All this stuff. There are some things that are true that just don't agree with. They don't agree with polygamy. They don't agree with men can marry Jews and Christians and women can't. They don't agree with the ta'ah or the obedience. They don't agree with qawama. They don't agree with domesticity. They don't agree with any of that stuff. But there are some things they just get wrong. For example, they talk about honor killings, and they genuinely believe that this is in Islam. There's nothing such as honor killings in Islam. They talk about FGM and mutilating this and that. The way they understand it is wrong, is incorrect. And in fact, they're the ones who are perpetrating FGM. According to the World Health Organization, FGM is if you have labiaplasty. They have labiaplasty. You know what labiaplasty is? Labia, when they tighten the vagina, sorry to say, yani. So that because they've had so much intercourse, gone here, gone there. So they tighten it up for the man's pleasure, ironically enough. Where's that happening? It's happening in the UK, it's happening in the US. Look at the articles. What's that called? It's called the FGM according to WHO. Why? But it's cosmetic. It's cosmetic. You're not going to call it FGM? But still, according to the WHO interpretation, it is FGM. And the most FGM of that nature is happening here in the West. Piercings. Vaginal piercings. This goes under the bloody WHO, World Health Organization's thing of How many, you tell me, go to Egypt, go to Pakistan, go to Indonesia, and ask 1,000 women, how many of you have a piercing in your vagina? And then go here and ask.
But they'll say it's consent.
No problem. The WHO definition doesn't say consent or lack thereof. If you is consensually mutilating yourself. That's, according to you, you're consensually mutilating yourself. We're not talking about your children and all this thing. We're talking about you are, yes, it's a good point though. That is what they'll say. We're saying that you still it is still defined as mutilation according to your definitions. And another problem is inheritance. So inheritance, they say that men get more than women. That's not correct. In fact, if we break it down, there are 4 cases in which females get 50% of what a male gets. للذكر مثل حظ الأنثيين, yeah, where the brother gets more than the sister. But there are 11 cases where a female gets the same as a male. For example, ولأبواه لكل واحد منهم السدس مما ترك إن كان لهم ولد. إن كان له ولد. If that the father and the mother gets 1/6 if there's a boy. There's 11 such cases where the female gets the same as the male, and there are 6 cases where it should be the female gets more than the male. Yeah,
There's 14 cases
Yeah.
where a woman gets more than. There's one case where a woman gets 14. She gets more than 14 male family members. Like more than the grandson, the father.
Yeah, وإن كنا نساء فوق اثنتين. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a misconception.
Yeah.
These things are misconceptions. So we do need to delineate the misconceptions from what but we don't lie. We don't say like, hijab is not compulsory or polygamy is not in Islam or whatever. These things are there because of the lack of equality, absolute equality. We believe in general equality. I mean, us and the feminists both believe in a general equality, but we have different exceptions. Because the Prophet said, they're equal, but there are exceptions. Our exceptions are different to theirs. Some of them don't even have exceptions. Ngozi, the woman who wrote the Feminist Manifesto, she said the only exception should be breastfeeding. So she would rule out things like maternity leave and so on. Some of them make the case for exceptions, and some of them don't. Some of them make the case that women should be given a head up so that they can catch up with men. And some of them don't make those cases. So we have to be nuanced and see who's making the argument, but bear that all in mind. So obviously, in summary, we believe that Allah, that Allah knows, does He not know what He created, and He is the all-subtle, all-aware. He knows what Allah created. He knows what He created. He created the man, He created the woman, He created the biologies of those people, He created the psychology and so on, and He knows what to give each. And that's it. We believe the Prophet Muhammad is a final prophet. He's an actual prophet that is speaking on behalf of God on earth, and that anything that he says is wahi, is revelation. It's not something which is a human construct or social construct. And that's how we actually argue it. If they say, why do you believe in what you believe in? We believe in it because we believe we can prove God's existence from first principles. We can prove that Prophet Muhammad is the prophet, and then whatever. So therefore, anything he says is from God. And because of that, we say that all the injunctions are true. That's how we prove it. We're not satisfied. But I think we should be more harsh with these people because a lot of them they want us to change the religion from inside. Wallahi, we do have sectarian issues, creedal sectarian issues. This should take priority because this means ridda or not. We're still talking about Allah above the arsh or laysa lahu makan wa zaman or these fine things. They won't take you to. These things are not like this. These things are not like this. These are important creedal discussions, but they're nothing like this. This is someone I say no to, the Prophet, Allah, saying no to Allah. And we're squabbling over some issues. This woman is saying no. The Quranverse says she said no. and then she's got followers. And we're talking about issues which there's ta'weel. And no one's saying that Prophet Muhammad is a liar. They're basically saying he's a liar. What do you want? What more do you want? They don't need to say it in that clear term, but they are implying it.
One's trying to understand Allah, like
Yeah.
God, and one's saying
He's a liar.
yeah.
Exactly. ومن الناس من يتخذ من دون الله أندادا يحبونهم كحب الله. It's a nid. It is a nid. This is it's a statue besides Allah. Just like the Samari, he left the people and they were taking the golden calf and praying to it, and he came. The story in Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah.
You know what's interesting about that? I was just looking. Sorry, is that what the scholars say is the reason why they made a golden calf is because in those days it was like inferiority complex. They had one, let's do the one. And
Very good point. Wallah, it's a good point.
Feminism.
Yes.
They're doing
Exactly the same thing. Yeah. But you know what's funny? They even had some rationale for it because the calf was making noises because the wind was going through it. They have some rationale, but it's mantiq batil. It's false. It's ghalit wa abatil. And on that note, inshallah, we're going to pray. Jazakumullah khairan, guys, and we're going to be doing this in Arabic as well. We're going to have a discussion, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.